Good morning. I have the added pleasure today to introduce somebody who really doesn't need that much introduction, Mike Tomasello, who has been central to our field and both on the comparative side and on the developmental, cognitive, social developmental side. And if I may just proudly say that he said that I'm talking to nearly everybody is here that is important and they understand what I'm saying. So I think this is a very good sign for the conference. And I don't know, he does a lot of things, as you know, so he has wrote a new talk in the meantime, and so he's going to have a different talk than what he has announced, and this talk will be about theory of mind, that I understand, and both in a little bit in our ape ancestors and a little bit more with humans. And so I'm really looking forward to it, and please, Mike, entertain us again.
Thank you, Jury. And yes, when they sent me 6 months ago asking for a title and an abstract, I thought, well, I have a new book, I'll talk about the book. And then I thought, an hour for a book, maybe not. So I did change my talk. The book has some introductory and discussion material, but the substance of it is 8 developmental pathways, as I call them. These are the 8, and I'm focused in the book only on things that are uniquely human. All this the majority of human cognitive development we share with other apes, and I'm only focused on the icing on the cake, as it were, only on the unique part. And so what I'm going to do today is talk about what I call social cognition. That is, I don't, as you all know from yesterday, you were here yesterday, I don't really like the term theory of mind that much, so let's call it social cognition. And what I do in every single one of the chapters is start out with what we know about ape ontogeny. There are a number of areas where we know very little about ape ontogeny. There are some where we know a good bit, but what we know about apes. This, by the way, is showing you that apes do gaze following and intention reading, but they don't do it till they're 3 years old. And in humans, it's shifted back to here. So we have a shifting of the ontogeny over evolutionary time. And then here is the child, the human ontogeny in that same domain. And they are connected in various ways, which I didn't put in here because it looks too scary and complicated. But in my talk today, I want to focus on this social cognition developmental pathway. And the endpoint I'm going to call coordinating perspectives. This is going to include understanding beliefs and false beliefs, and you'll see why I focus on why I call it coordinating perspectives, because I think it's a larger set of cognitive skills, including understanding appearance and reality and all that. And so that will be my general topic. And I'm going to argue in every single one of these that the uniquely human aspects of it, on top of the ape ones, all come from evolved capacities for shared intentionality. And I'll explain a little bit about that, but I'm not going into too much detail. And those evolved capacities require social interaction to actualize. So they are maturational, but if a child was on a desert island and never met another person, never had any social interactions, the capacities would atrophy. The capacities need to be exercised to come into existence. So it's a, I don't know, interactional theory, if you will. I don't know what you want to call it. Transactional causality. Okay, so let's start about what is a belief. And I know for some of you this is elementary, but I just need to establish this because it's central to what I want to do today. So a belief is not just a representation of a situation. I look in the room, I see a cat on a mat. I walk into the next room, I have a picture in my mind of the cat on the mat. I muse about it, I think about it, I daydream about it, but it's not a belief. It's a belief when I have an attitude about it, I have an attitude about that relationship. The attitude is the philosophical word that Hannes and Joseph and all those people have used. And specifically, a belief is an attitude that my perspective on the situation matches an objective perspective on the situation. Okay? So the key is, for my talk today, is that to judge a belief as false, the child must relate the subjective and objective perspectives and see whether they match or not. All right? This is critical. Otherwise, you can have some other kind of mental state. I see it, all kinds of things about it, but until I can do that comparison, that relating, I don't have what we would normally call a belief, which can be false. It cannot match the actual situation. And in the false belief situation, in the false belief task, we actually have three perspectives that we have to coordinate to understand it in an adult-like way. So I'm saying adult-like false belief understanding. I believe it's here because I saw it moved over here. You believe it's there, but then there's where it objectively really is. Now, in most false belief tasks, these are supposed to be the same thing. I saw it move there, so I know it's really there. But maybe it's a trick. You know, these psychologists are irritating and tricky and whatnot. And so to really understand in an adult-like way, I have to understand I could be wrong. Right? It's really just a belief. I just believe it's there. I believe it's there because I saw it put there, but I don't know for sure. So there's what I believe. It's different from what she believes. And both of us, it could be different from what is really the case. And to really understand it, you have to relate coordinate those three perspectives and come up with something that takes account of all of them. That I believe it's here because I saw it put there. She believes it's there because that's where she saw it put, but then it's really somewhere. Okay, so let's start with apes. The developmental pathways, we start with apes in all cases, and then we're going to map the child on top of it. Let's start with apes. This is our sort of classic experiment, if you will, of food competition. There is a banana on top of here that both individuals can see. There's a, sorry, I'm so used to this, I'm being egocentric. So it's a food competition. And this over here is the subordinate chimp, and the dominant chimp is back here where you can't see her. They are females. If you put food in the middle of the room and open the doors, the dominant would always get it. You say, how do I know that? That's because that's how we define dominance. The one who always gets it is the dominant. So we have a pretest, and we test that. All right. And then what the trick is there's a piece of food out here in the open that they're competing for, and there's a piece of food over here that only the subordinate can see. And what's going to happen is the door will go down briefly, so the dominant on this side can't see the subordinate, and then it'll go up. The subordinate's door goes up first because we want to rule out the strategy of waiting to see where the dominant goes and going the opposite place. The subordinate has to choose first, and here's what happens. You notice, you see how, okay, she grabs it carefully, the dominant goes over and gets the one, and then checks to make sure there's not more over there where it was. Okay, so we argued that this is evidence that this guy, the other guy, the subordinate guy, knows what the other one can see, what he can and cannot see. The content of what they see, not gaze direction, the content of what they see. If you put a rock there, they wouldn't compete like that. They know he sees a banana and that he has the goal of eating bananas. Now, the knowledge version of this is now going to be one piece of food, not two. One piece of food, not two. We have the two buckets. Okay, and I'm the dominant here, and you're the subordinate. And here comes a piece of food, and we're both watching, and it goes under the bucket. And now I can't see it. It's a situation where I can't see it, and you can tell that I can't see it, but you still don't go for it because I saw it being put in there just a second ago. So you know that I know it's still there. Know in the sense of I'm acquainted with it. I saw it a moment ago. Not anything deeper in knowledge. Okay, and then if my door is down, so that I don't see it hidden, and now my door comes back up again, now you go for it. Because you know that I don't know that it's there, because I didn't witness the hiding process. We even have a version where I witnessed it, and then we switch for another dominant, and now you go, because even though I witnessed it, this other guy didn't. So anyway, we're very convinced that these are all the studies. Almost all of them have a child version that either we copied from somebody else or that we did ourselves. And based on this, this is the review paper from 10 years ago now, that chimps understand what others see, hear, know, and the study was done after this review, make inferences. So they can tell when something is gone, that the other guy must have taken it. He made an it's complicated, but the other guy could tell where it was by forming an inference. And so I know that he made that inference, and therefore that food is gone when it's my turn to take it. However, over this same period of time, we have 5 published studies, 4 of them validated with tasks with children, either by ourselves or someone else, with lots of different methodologies. One of our concerns in Leipzig when we were doing the ape research is that there aren't many labs that can do ape research, and we felt an obligation to replicate our own findings, with never an exact replication, but aiming at the same question, but from different methodologies. So sometimes it's a human partner, sometimes it's a chimp partner, sometimes it's cooperation, sometimes it's competition. Various control conditions, the 2 main ones being a true belief control or an ignorance control. Sometimes there was training to get them to know the elements of the task. Sometimes that was not required. The response is choosing object choice. The food competition, like you just saw. The chimp chess was this back and forth where it's you choose and then I have to figure out what's left for me. And in all of them, these are all action-based paradigms where the chimp has to make a choice. They fail. And we tried everything that we could think of. And then Chris Creponier came to my lab and said, I want to do one of the looking studies, one of the infant false belief studies with the chimps. And I said, okay. And he chose the Vicky Southgate et al. 2007 paper, Anticipatory Looking. And it's as close to the paradigm as we could get. So, this guy sees the object put in here, then he's out of the room, it's changed to here, and then he comes back and reaches down the middle, and we look where the anticipatory look goes. Does he look where he saw it being put last, or does he look where the subject, you're looking from the point of view of the chimp, or does he look where the chimps and bonobos, by the way, or does he look where it really is, where he sees it? And we get a significant result in both false belief 1 and false belief 2. We also replicated this. This was 2 studies with very different materials. One of them was the reaching paradigm, and another one was a hiding paradigm where the guy's hidden and then he moves when you're not there and so forth. Okay, so for me, this really sort of crystallized the issue, because now we have chimps who don't seemingly go on to do all the complicated mind-reading things that humans do later in ontogeny. Sorry, thank you. They don't seemingly do those things, and yet they seem to have this first step. So here's the sort of picture, is that apes are doing whatever you want to call these. This morning I deleted implicit and explicit. Thank you very much. Indirect, spontaneous, direct, elicited. Children are doing these as infants and these as 4- and 5-year-olds, and the apes are only doing those. So how do we explain this? Okay, that's my challenge to myself for the day. Here's my interpretation, and I want to say that after I came up with this interpretation, I met with Vicky Southgate at a conference, and she said she had developed a very similar explanation that she's published also. And the interpretation is this, that let's just stick with that one paradigm. In the looking studies, but especially in the Southgate paradigm, the infant of the ape anticipation of what the other one's going to do is based on knowing that agents know about things by seeing them. Okay, they know about them by seeing them, and they search for things where they saw them or where they know they are. Okay, this is basic knowledge about agents and how they behave, how they search for objects, how they forage for food, right? But, and I want to stress, I'm not Celia Hayes, in case anybody got anything mixed up here. No, these are not behavior rules. This is not submentalizing. The apes and infants understand the content of what the other sees and knows. This is serious mind reading, but I don't think it's beliefs. And this goes back to it's a definitional thing, but the way that I define beliefs here, what they're not doing is their own view of the situation does not figure in at all. They're saying, what's he going to do? There's where he saw it. Where's he going to go? They're not saying, oh, I know it's there. He has a false belief. They don't have to do that. They just have to track what does he see and know, and what does that mean about what he's going to do. Yes, in the situation, they are perfectly capable of seeing that he's searching in the wrong place, but it doesn't enter into their attempt to understand and predict what he's going to do. They're just predicting what he's going to do. And we show from all this stuff here that they're really capable of doing all that. The chimps are, and the infants are as well. So they're really doing all of that. But in this study, that's exactly what they're doing. They're not doing anything more. The fact that the infant or the chimp has seen it move to a new place is not relevant. So there's no comparison with their own perspective, and there's no comparison with an objective perspective. The judgment of falseness is not necessary. Okay, that's the interpretation. It's really something, but it's not a belief. Now you say, they could be doing that. The older children could be doing that in the classic task too. You can solve the classic task exactly the same way. You just say people search for things where they last found them. That gets you the change location task too. And with an appropriate switch, it gets you the change contents also. You know that people are going to expect to find in a box what is labeled on the outside. And so that's what they know. But there are two pieces of evidence that argue against that. One is this reality bias or pull of the real that you see in 3-year-old children. To my knowledge, and somebody can please correct me if I'm wrong, in the infant studies, there doesn't seem to be a pull of the real or a reality bias in any of those studies. So the 3-year-olds are doing that and getting it, not just randomly guessing, but systematically getting it wrong. So something changing is there. And it's probably, I'm sure it's in the direction that Joseph Perner has been working in of about a default to objectivity, a teleology that we just default to, everybody thinks what is the objective state of affairs. But I believe this is new at 3 years of age. Before that, they don't really have that notion. And the other fact is coming from a long history of noticing that the false belief task shares a lot with other tasks like appearance reality and so forth. Perner has called them all perspective problems. They're problems where the two perspectives clash and you have to resolve it in some way. And I'm gonna elaborate on that in just a second. And Hannes Riccacci in particular has shown strong correlations among these different tasks. So let me tell you what these other tasks are that make it convincing, to me at least, that what the 4-year-olds are doing when they solve the direct task, the traditional tasks, is something where they're coordinating perspectives. So these are a series of studies. I'm going to tell you about 2 of them. There are actually 3. I want to tell you about 2 and then one other from other labs. And what they do is they present you with a problem of coordinating 2 perspectives on a situation simultaneously. So here's the first one, and I could have an elaborate view of this, and I'm going to do it in a sort of short, in a minimal way. And if you don't understand, just sort of look at me funny, and I'll try to elaborate more. This is a study by Henrika Moll et al. And the key is there are going to be 2 versions of each of these. All right, there are going to be 2 versions, and one of them is going to be sequential judgments, and the other is going to be simultaneous judgments. So here is this is her color filter task, and you ask the child, and they're going to solve, at 3 years old, they're going to solve the sequential one, but they're going to flunk the simultaneous one. So the sequential one is 3-year-olds now. What color does this bear look to you? Green? And now the kids have had experience with a color filter themselves, playing with it, and they just look over there. What does it look like to her? It looks blue. So they can make each individual judgment. But then they hold it up, and the experiment points to it and says, does this look the same or different to the 2 of you? How does it look like to her? How does it look like to you? And all of a sudden the 3-year-olds are incoherent. They don't say anything coherent. They can't, what the 4-year-olds start to say is, well, it looks green to me, but it looks blue to her. And somehow when it's one object, simultaneously they're having trouble. When they sort of two different judgments, they're fine. Very similar in the appearance reality task. This actually had a nonverbal version. They pointed to, I won't go into that, but basically the child discovers that this is a sponge, and then they say, what is the new person? The 3-year-olds can say, a new person is going to say it's a rock. And then you say, well, what is it really? It's a sponge. And do you all think it's the same thing, or do you all think it's something different? What do you think it is? What does she think it is? And now they have trouble. When it's one thing and it has to have two realities. Joseph Perner's articles on this are the best, that they can't understand that it is two things at the same time. That's too much. And I would say the dual naming task, Martin Dockery, Perner, Riccacci have all done versions of it. The spectral task is in this same category, I would say. It's not the same thing, but it's similar. I judge that this is a bush. Somebody else calls it a tree. If they're separate, it's no problem. If you make them say somehow at the same time, what is it for you, what is it for them? It's hard to say, well, for me, I call it a bush and he calls it a tree. Okay, so the simultaneous is difficult. And my argument is that there are struggles of the, that has to be resolved is that with the emergence of an objective perspective on things, that there's a way that it really is, the children haven't quite figured out how to resolve this. So they think nothing can be both blue and green at the same time. That makes no sense. Nothing can be both a rock and a sponge at the same time. That makes no sense. Nothing can be a tree and a bush at the same time. That makes no sense. So they're struggling. They don't know how to do it. The 4-year-olds have gotten their act together, and I'll come back to that. The fourth task is, of course, the false belief. This is the same thing you saw before, where she thinks it's here, I think it's there. It can't be in both places at the same time. That's perplexing. So all 4 of those have this same structure, that they're beginning to understand there's an objective way things are, and we've got 2 different views on it that conflict, and I'm kind of lost. So 3-year-olds begin to experience these as perspective problems because they begin to take an objective perspective on things with conflicting perspectives. The infants and apes don't even see the conflict because they don't have the objective perspective that's making them clash. 4- and 5-year-olds begin to solve these perspective problems by coordinating the perspectives in ways appropriate to the specific problem. And it's going to require executive function. I will come back to that in a minute. So here is the new part of this slide from before. The coordination is that the object appears different from different viewing angles. Problem solved. Coordination is that the object appears as one thing when you look at it and another thing when you touch it. Problem solved. I learn how language works, and so the coordination is an object can be called by 2 different names. And the false belief is solved by he's got a wrong belief. He's got a false belief about what the objective situation is. So they have a conflict, and the solution to the conflict is the creation of a new concept, a new way of looking at things. There's an objective situation of the way it really is, and there are different subjective perspectives on it which may or may not match it. And I'm saying that's the full deal. What the infants are doing is something really important and is absolutely necessary to that whole process, but it's not the full process until you get to this coordination of perspectives. That's the hypothesis. Okay, so what is the developmental process? I need to go back to infancy. At the same time that infants are, and I want to say that there aren't so many accounts of the developmental process in the development of false belief, understanding false beliefs. There's, of course, the nativist proposals, but the ones that aren't strongly nativist and want to make room for child's learning, there are not so many specific proposals on that, and I'm going to make one that's fairly specific. So back to infancy, joint attention as the earliest manifestation. Somebody asked me that, one of my students. My first publication I ever had in 1983 had joint attention in the title, so I've been studying this for quite a while, and I'm still not sure I know exactly what it is, but in any case, I've been trying for a while. Joint attention as the earliest manifestation of human species-unique skills and motivations of shared intentionality, And our last 2 decades of research, apes don't do this. They don't engage in joint attention where they really know they're sharing attention to an object with someone else. Various lines of evidence, I have reviewed them in various places. I'm not going to go into detail here. Joint attention, especially as it occurs in communication, and I will lay that out in a second, requires a coordination of perspectives, again requiring executive function. So this is the key to the argument. Why are the apes not getting to the second step that the kids are getting to? Because they don't have the evolved capacities to engage with others in a negotiation of perspectives that happens in joint attention, scaled up to linguistic discourse, which again I will come to here. And again, I keep mentioning executive function in the background, and I'm going to come to that because the coordination of first you have to conceptualize the perspectives. That requires the shared intentionality, and then the executive function is a way of coordinating them. Oh, hers is wrong, mine is right. Here's the objective perspective, and so forth. Okay, so I'm going to show you what I mean by what's different. I'm going to summarize all of our research by showing you some videos. And I apologize, the first one is a home video. And I get very excited here. Is there any way to turn the sound down? Because my voice is very obnoxious here. But no, it doesn't really matter. But it's not as bad as Sue's, which scared everybody out of their chairs. But any case, and the reason I get so excited is because this is her 9-month birthday to the day. And I'm observing the 9-month revolution, and I'm going crazy. But anyway, we're rolling a ball back and forth. Now, watch her looking behavior. That's what I want to focus on here. Watch the looking behavior and the coordination of perspectives going on here. Whoops, sorry. In left. And now, okay, she rolls it back, not very well. And I'm so, oh my God. And she rolls it back, and I can't believe it, you know. And she's looking up to the face. Sorry, you can't see this so well, but she's looking up to the face. All right, now it comes back to her by accident, and she looks up to the face. There we are. Okay, there's this back and forth. Okay, now here's the classic. This happens very, very quickly. This is the classic showing behavior. Okay, now watch quickly. The kid doesn't want anything here. Just okay. Chimps do not do this. No other species on the planet says, "Isn't this interesting?" And that's the only motivation for the behavior. Isn't that interesting? And they want you to say, "Yeah, cool." And if you go, okay, that's not going to do it. They want to share their excitement about this object with you and share visual attention, but also share an attitude toward it, an attitude of excitement. And here's your classic book reading. And again, home film, but watch the looking behavior. Not sure why that didn't go. Okay. Watch the third one over there. Now watch her looking. We're pointing at the picture, and she looks back to mom to see that mom is looking. It's the sibling behind the camera, and they get, and then, all right, and then she looks to the sibling. Isn't that cool? Okay. See, we're coordinating our attention to this thing, and that's the key. Now, let me show you a chimp behavior. This lasts about a minute, but I think I'm going to let it start running. All right, watch the chimp playing with toys. This is a human-raised chimp. This is a caretaker who's taken care of her from about 1 year old. And there's the ball. And I chose these films because they have some overlap with what I just showed you. Here's the ball. She's trying to get us to play with the ball. The chimp likes the ball, is playing with the ball, but doesn't really have any interest in rolling it back and forth or throwing it back and forth or sharing it. The chimp is into the ball individually. Okay? We're having fun, but we're having fun by ourselves. All right, now the book reading. Now we have a book reading. The chimp is interested in the book. My daughter that you saw in the thing, who's now 8 years old, said, "She's reading, she's reading." She's interested in the book, but no look back. No look back, no pointing, no sharing, nothing that's sharing. Okay, and all those toys around, which she could hold up and show the way that other child did. She could show that if she wanted to, but she doesn't show it. So no coordination of looking behavior, no holding up and showing, no collaboration back and forth collaboratively, etc. So this is the phenomenon. This is not just us. The Matsusawa lab in Japan has tried finding it the same way with a chimp mother, with the child's real mother, with the chimp baby's real mother. And they have a paper with the title in it. It says all kinds of interesting things they do, but no joint attention. All right. So now if you were studying some other aspect of development, you might say, well, yeah, okay, this is an interesting difference, but what does it have to do with what I'm interested in? But if we're interested in reading other minds, this has to be important. It just has to be. All this coordination about what you're looking at and what I'm looking at and whether there's, and I want to share it with you, and if you're not looking at it, I want to show it to you. That has to be part of the process of us coming to understand how other people's minds work. So this is my sort of schematic structure of what's going on. The dual level structure of shared intentionality in general and joint attention, this comes as a package. That is, I have joint attention to something, you have one perspective, and I have another perspective. And here I have to pause because I had a 5-hour train ride with Joseph Perner coming over here, and we had to discuss this. There are different levels of perspective taking. The classic level 1, level 2 will do for my purposes here. So what the infants are doing is not taking perspective in Joseph Perner's view of the same thing under different aspects, but it's level 1. I see something you don't. You see something I don't. That it is just whether you see it or not how you see it. That's the classic level 1, level 2 distinction. So the infants are doing the level 1. The whole reason of pointing is because you don't see it. I have to know you don't see it, and that's why I want you to see it, though you're not seeing it. But it's dual level. Somebody said, well, what comes first? Is it joint attention first, and then this, or you have to take their perspective? No, it comes as a package. Right? This is the structure, this triangular triadic structure that I've been looking at since my first publication. Okay, so this triadic structure is what is going to be different this way. This is a schema that structures their social interactions with others. So they now interact with others with a joint focus of attention that involves different level 1 perspectives on that joint focus of attention. I always hesitate to mention Davidson because I don't really understand him, but his notion of triangulation is something that Henrico Moll and I built on to say that you really can't have the notion of perspective without the sharedness. This is still speaking to the point that they come as a package. If you look out one window of the building and I look out another, we just see different things. To say we have different perspectives, it has to be a common thing. We're both looking at this, and you see it from that angle, and I see it from that angle, or you see this part of it, and I see the other part of it. There has to be some sharedness about which we have different visual information of one kind or another. And there is really no notion of a single perspective. You can say, yes, I, in the privacy of my room, am looking at this from a certain perspective, but that's because I know my cognitive abilities are such that I know that there are different possible perspectives than the one I'm taking. So the notion of the only one perspective doesn't make sense. Perspective means there are multiple possible ones. And so that's the schema that is going to structure human social interaction from the 9-month revolution onward. Here, again, this is what I said with pointing. In early pointing, which usually children are pointing around their first birthdays, a month or two before quite often. And here's what's happening in pointing is that, for example, the infant is looking somewhere else, and the adult says, "Oh, look!" All right, and this is the comprehension version of it. And the infant then looks over there and joint attention. I have a paper somewhere said reference an invitation to joint attention. So I am focused on something and I say, look at this. I'm inviting you to join me in focusing on this thing. The flip side of it would be just the opposite, switch the child and the adult's looking at something else, and the child points and says, look, and I know you're not looking at it, I want you to look at it. All right? The perspectives, and that's why I put it in scare quotes, level 1 perspectives go from being not aligned to being aligned. So in this behavior, the child is having to see if my perspective matches yours or not. So if it doesn't match and I want it to, I point. Okay, and if you're pointing for me, you were judging that they didn't match, and now they're matching. So this is the behavior that I've been stressing from the beginning about coordinating perspectives is key to understanding beliefs. That's what they have to do in this joint intentional interactions. They have to coordinate and relate their perspectives. They're recursive, and I won't get into that. This is the Sperber and Wilson relevance theory that what does she intend for me to know, the kind of neo-Gricean way of looking at things in this communication. When you point somewhere and I look at it, I'm basically saying, you know, what does she want me to figure out from this? And so, again, to repeat my point one more time, this is mental coordination, and mental coordination is not simply mind reading. It's not simply reading the other guy's mind, it's relating mine to his. Okay, now I have a philosopher in my lab in Leipzig that came up with this term here, joint attention to mental content. Content is a term that philosophers use a lot, psychologists typically don't. But the idea was this, that in a conversation, what is the structure of a conversation? The structure of a conversation is that we have a joint topic of conversation. If we go on to a new topic, we say it's a new conversation. The conversation is about the topic. We're talking about today, we're talking about false beliefs. That's the topic of our conversation, and these are conventional linguistic expressions with semantic content. So when I say the cat is on the mat, there is a content to that that is the situation or the proposition that the cat is on the mat. I make a comment about it, which is coming from my perspective. I say, that's a pretty cat. You make a comment, I think it's a Siamese. We make different comments about the same topic. And so this is, as you can see, I used exactly the same structure here. This is joint attention up a level to the mental content of linguistic expressions. Not joint attention to a chair, but joint attention to the utterance, this is a chair, or to the proposition underlying the utterance, this is a chair. So now we're really starting to share something more than just visual attention, but we're sharing the contents of our minds, if you will, that are accessible because we have a public language with shared symbols. I will say here now, this is a little bit, I'm backtracking just a little bit. I didn't want to do this too early. In the way that I am looking at each of these developmental pathways in the book, and this one as well, I want to say there are two things that happen maturationally. One is our 9-month revolution of joint intentionality, me and another individual. And the second one, at around 3 years of age, is collective intentionality. And this is more, this is more the, I have a typo, but at least it wasn't a proctologist. And so this is already making us different from chimps. All right, this is already the unique line starting. And this is like Bratman and Gilbert taking a walk together, painting a house together. This is two people doing something together with a joint goal and meshed intentions, etc. This is John Searle's worry about institutional reality, like I mentioned the other day, about money and universities and stuff that are created from collective intentions, not just you and me as individuals. You and me didn't invent the university. This is something bigger than us. It was here before we were born, and so forth. And these typically have a normative dimension. The president of the university has certain deontic powers, and so forth and so on. So and money has certain powers because of its collective existence. So this is what happens at 3 years old. I've sometimes called this the normative turn. It's the objective, is this objective normative turn. And this is what's happening. This is a maturation. This is an evolved capacity that emerges at this age. I will say, I have a long thing here, but I have an explanation in a couple of my books on the natural history of human thinking and the natural history of human morality, which argue that these are adaptations for living in cultural life with collective products like conventions and social norms and so forth. And this evolved adaptation for culture and for thinking objectively and normatively is maturing at around 3 years of age. Think back to what I said before. Maturing in this case means the capacity is maturing and it's not going to become actualized unless you're engaging in social interaction with others. Okay, so now I'm saying that because now we're going to segue over, we're going to transition over to Joseph Perner's real perspective, the level 2 perspectives, because when we're having these conversations and when we're having joint attention to mental content, one of the things I can do is make an assertion. I can say the cat is on the mat. And you say, no, it's not. Or you say the cat is on the rug, or whatever you may say, the cat is in the kitchen. So then you assert the cat is on the mat, or sorry, I assert the cat is on the mat. I believe it's true. Philosophers like Robert Brandom say that assertions have a normative component because I am committed to their being true. I'm committed to their matching reality. So they're normative both in the sense that they can be correct or incorrect, and they're normative in the sense that I'm committed to them, and you can trust me that with everything I know, I'm telling you they're true. And you say false. So your judgment is now about my assertion. Your judgment is not about reality. Your judgment is about my assertion about reality. So I have asserted a belief, and you have rejected the belief. So now we have a clashing not just of visual perspectives, but of mental content, of propositional content that underlies the assertion. All right? So now we're getting to perspectives without any scare quotes. The same thing under different aspects. Or you say it's a rock, and I say it's a sponge. You say it's a pony, I say it's a horse. Right? But now we resolve that because, but in false beliefs, we have to resolve it by saying, because an object can't be in two places at once, you believe it's here, I believe it's there. The objective situation is it can't be in two places at once, and so the resolution to that is one of us is wrong. Okay, only in false beliefs, only one of us can be right. Okay, so what is the evidence for this view? And I'm going to give you 4 pieces of evidence, some more direct than others. The first is that there are 4 studies, actually only 3, and I added in another one that's in the same direction, showing longitudinal correlations between joint attention and false belief understanding. I draw your attention to the bolded one by Beata Sodian, which I believe is the best one. And they show a very nice correlation between children's joint attention behavior, individual differences in children's joint attention behavior at an early age, between 12 and 18 is my memory, somewhere in there, 12 and 18 months, and at false belief understanding and other measures of theory of mind later. So we have a correlation. Yeah, that tells you something. This is a Tony Charman study, does something like that with children with autism, where you can get much wider variation in terms of joint attention, some who hardly do it at all. And the children with autism who hardly do any joint attention at all are later or don't acquire false belief understanding. So, so this correlation is at least prima facie evidence that these things are linked. Second is language. Everybody knows, everybody who's ever studied individual differences in false belief understanding, we know that language is related in some way. The problem is we don't know exactly what way. There are a lot of different ways. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. I knew I was forgetting something about this. There are also some correlations with behavior in the infant false belief task. But one thing that I haven't stressed so far is that doing this coordination of stuff, it depends on understanding what others know as measured by the infant false belief task. And so there are some correlations in these studies with behavior in infant false belief task, but there are also correlations with the joint attention. And the joint attention ones are actually a bit higher, is my reading of the literature. Now, one fact that I think is not appreciated enough is the research on deaf children. As you know, most deaf children are born to hearing parents, And so if they're in a rural area or they're not educated parents or something, quite often they don't get any sign language till much later. And Michael Siegel did research on children who were not getting any conventional sign language until much later. And they don't pass the false belief task until they're like adolescents. It's we're not talking about a 1-year delay. We're talking about years of delay if they don't have any language. Now, of course, any conventional language. Of course, they have sort of informal gestures, but not a conventional language. Of course, the problem is there are many aspects of language. Is it because they don't have words for mental states? Is it because of whatever? And there's no full resolution to that for sure, but I'll give you our training study. Our idea was what I showed you already, that conversation and discourse. That's where it is, where we're exchanging perspectives. I say the cat's on the mat, you say he's in the kitchen, etc. So we call it perspective shifting discourse. The discourse was about, we had a false belief pretest, and all the children failed the pretest, but they were 3 years old, so they were close. They were close, but they were failing. If anybody passed it, they were out of the study. So a false belief pretest I think we did a Smarties task as a pretest and a change location as or vice versa, but they were different tests. And the control condition, they just played with these deceptive objects like a rock sponge. It was a candle and a ball or something. And in the experimental, we had all kinds of perspective shifting discourse about those objects. What does it look like? No, it's not that. What is it really? What did you think it was? I thought it was this. We had a little puppet. He thought it was that, but now he knows it's this. And we had all kinds of perspective shifting discourse. We had some where we had mental state terms. I was just using mental state terms, but we had some of it where they were just perception terms, like what does it look like, and not really what do you think it was, and so forth. In any case, what we got was that in a false belief post-test, which was a different test than the pre-test, but the same logic, no change in the control condition and improvement in the experimental condition. Training studies have their limitations. Training studies only show sufficiency. They show here's a condition where I can make it happen. They don't show necessity, so it may have nothing to do with the real world. But I think training studies are a really important way of showing here are some experiences that can have an effect. So again, with the language, you can tell from my explanation here and my evolutionary approach and my talking about the evolutionary emergence of capacities, I'm not against nativist approaches or whatever, but I think in this case, there is a nativistic component and structure, but this finding with these deaf kids tells us that it's not sufficient, that the capacity, the evolved capacity has to be played out. It has to be exercised in social interactions with others. That's the hypothesis anyway. Executive function. We have a similar problem in that everybody knows executive function is one of the highest correlates of behavior in false belief tasks. Individual differences in executive function, individual differences in false belief performance. If you look at, but there are two, executive function, the terminology and stuff is a mess. There are so many different things, but take these two sort of central components. One is a more inhibition type thing, and people have talked about inhibition being related to false belief because the child has to inhibit their tendency to go for the real way it is and say, oh no, he's looking not where it really is, but where it is. So they have to inhibit that. But there's also a component of executive function, which is more like coordination. This is like, it's called different things. These guys call it, what do they call it? Response conflict. So like in the dimensional card sort, first you sort them by color, then you sort them by shape, and so you're coordinating the different dimensions around these objects. And so the coordination side of executive function, and my reading of the literature, and some of you know it better than I do, is that this meta-analysis of Devine and Hughes and the Diaz and Farrar longitudinal study, and this is from the Riccacci lab, the Fitzke et al. Task batteries, show that they both work. I'm going to come here. So they both work, but the coordination part seems to be a little bit stronger. Benson et al. Did a nice little training study where they looked at individual differences in response conflict executive function, and the kids who were already higher in this ability were quicker to learn. They did a training study, but they assessed their executive function abilities to see who could take advantage of the learning, and the kids who were better in this took advantage of the learning better. And, of course, of special importance, I think, because we don't have many experiments of these things, Susan Carey, Lindsay Powell and Susan Carey did a series of studies on executive function depletion, where you overtax their executive function and then give them a false belief task. So the logic is you're cutting out their executive function and see what they do. You're diminishing their executive capacities and seeing what they do. And they have one study where it's more of an inhibition thing that's being, it's just a delay of gratification thing, where that's being suppressed. But in study 4, they suppress by making kids do something that's more conflict resolution, more coordination. This is a quote from the Benson study. Response conflict executive function facilitates representational theory of mind development by enhancing children's ability to learn from relevant experiences. So I just put this quote here because this gives you, again, this idea of the capacity and then the actual realizing of the capacity in interaction. So this is facilitating the learning. And finally, the fourth piece of evidence, which is maybe a little bit indirect, is the following. In the book, in the 2019 book, I think I only made, I tried to spell out my arguments and be more reviewed literature I hadn't reviewed before and whatnot, but I was really trying to consolidate things that I already knew. But I made one, for me, discovery in writing the book, and that is that this age 3 transition, a lot of things are happening, and I discovered that in a lot of our studies, we had data on 2-year-olds failing and 3-year-olds passing things, and I didn't realize we had so much 2-year-old failing. And so when I actually put it together, in many of our domains, in the social cognition, which we're talking about here, these explicit false belief and appearance reality, we have lots of things where 2-year-olds are not doing it and 3-year-olds are doing it. I should mention, people might say the 3-year-old transition, then why aren't they doing false belief at 3 years? And I would say 2 things. One is it takes a while to work it out. And the other is when you get, have always been a tradition of false belief tasks with 3-year-olds where you reduce task demands and whatnot, and 3-year-olds start to succeed. So I'm thinking of things like the Rubio-Fernandez study and others like that, where 3-year-olds are succeeding if you manage to make it in a more child-friendly way. So the idea would be that 3-year-olds can do it if everything is sort of perfect and makes it easy for them, but in the normal task, there's a lot of coordination to be done, and it takes a while for them to learn how to do that. And communication is a difficult one because, of course, children are talking before 3 years old. They're using a conventional language before 3 years old, but you can say they're using it in a more pragmatic way, understanding conventions, where understanding that people in our group call this a toma, and from another group, we don't know what they call it because they're not from our group. So understanding our language as a convention, as a shared convention, is Gil Diesendruck's research in particular has shown that that emerges at around 3 years of age. Hannes Ricacci and I did a study on the normativity of speech acts where 2-year-olds failed and 3-year-olds succeeded. Cultural learning. This is from the Hungarian group about pedagogy. We would have a different view on it. I think it's the 3-year-olds in Luke Butler's work before they really understand that this is generic, generalized cultural knowledge. And before that, they're learning interesting things, but not that. Collaboration, joint commitment, and normative protest. And again, these are all the studies where we show presence at 3 to 4 and absence at 2. Prosociality, notion of fairness, has a normative component that just being nice doesn't have. And again, we have reciprocity. Social norms, enforcing norms normatively. I had forgotten that we had absence in 2-year-olds until I went back and looked at the study. Normative respect for possession, and in moral identity, guilt. We show 3-year-olds showing a guilt response. And so these are all either normative or objective, and I won't go into my thing. Normative and objective are part of the same package. Something that's normative means that it's not my personal opinion, that it's actually something larger than my personal opinion. It's an objective fact about the world, that it's wrong to do that, and so forth. So that kind of normativity and objectivity go together. Okay, so I'll wrap up here. I just want to say that this was my account that I gave in my book in that chapter. But then I decided, because I did a bunch of other things in that chapter as well that got off on other parts of social cognition, and I wanted to make this argument in a focused way. And so I made the argument in a PNAS paper from a year or two ago. And that's where, if you want to see more of the nuances of the argument about why it's response conflict, executive function, and not only inhibition, it's both, but it's not only inhibition, it's both. And the language based on discourse and not just based on mental state terms or whatever, those arguments are spelled out more in this paper. So the evolutionary hypothesis is that basic mind reading in primates and evolved for competition. I have to know what the other one sees and what he knows is there in order that helps me out-compete him. And then building on this, that's a necessary component. People sometimes ask me, you're so big on cooperation doing all this. You know, the most cooperative species on the planet is ants and bees. You know, why aren't they doing all this? Well, because they have ant brains and bee brains, all right? We have chimp brains scaled up. They have whatever was before them scaled up. So building on what primates are already doing, humans evolved further mind-reading skills for more cooperative interactions. Those are the skills of shared intentionality. Mental coordination and perspective-taking in collaborative activities, like collaborative foraging. Recursive mental coordination and perspective-taking in cooperative and conventional communication, which I argue evolved to support collaborative activities, to help coordinate the collaborative activities. And perhaps uniquely human executive function evolved for this, and I will put a big emphasis on perhaps. I have no idea. But we have a study where we show, Esther Herman and I, that three-year-olds and chimps have very similar executive function capacities, but 6-year-old children have different executive function capacities. So the well-known gain in executive function from 3 to 6 starts from a chimp starting place at age 3. Maybe they're related. Maybe it's evolved to support the social cognitive stuff. Who knows? And the objective normative perspective of culture, which evolved to support humans as well. And the ontogenetic hypothesis is what I've been spelling out my whole hour here. Infants start out with general ape mind-reading skills and evolved capacity for recursive mental coordination with others only becomes actual in social interaction with others. And understanding false beliefs is an emergent ability for coordinating perspective-taking and collaboration, recursive perspective-taking and cooperative communication and linguistic discourse, and cultural normative interactions. Thank you very much.
So I'm trying to coordinate the questions. Raise your hand on the back as well, and I will see. Okay, Agi.
Thank you very much. This was wonderful. I'm here. This was a wonderful and very rich talk. I would like to challenge your proposal that the ability to coordinate two perspectives of mental content emerges at the age of 3 with an example from everyday life. And this is the case of bilingual infants. So bilingual infants not only can have 2 words for a dog, but it can also happen that if a bilingual infant is dominant in one language, it can happen that the mother talks in one language and the child answers in another language, and the child
I watch this every day.
Exactly. And the child can even correct the content to which the mother refers from a different perspective in a different register. So if I call an object mistakenly a lion in Hungarian, the child will correct me in English that this is not a lion, it's a tiger. So is this not perspective coordination? And
okay, so this is I think this is the most difficult theoretical part of the whole account. And again, I've talked with Joseph about it because he's thought about perspective more than anyone else. And I would just say, you have to focus in this case about this sort of teleological or objective view and really understanding different perspectives. So if the child's correction is, no, the adult says it's a dog and the child says it's a cat, we're disagreeing about reality. But if you say, the cat is on the mat, you make a proposition, and I say, no, you're wrong, now we're disagreeing about your proposition. We're not disagreeing about the reality, we're disagreeing about your proposition. And so that, to me, is the transition that we talk about, the attitudes to mental content and joint attention to mental content, is that we are discussing your proposition. Or my proposition. So if there are examples of that kind of thing, then I'm on board. But it's a subtle difference. But if the difference is about you think it's X and I think it's Y, and you say cat, I say dog, then that would be level 1. Okay? It wouldn't be the 2. But, okay?
Colleen?
So it seems like one of the primary ingredients in this sauce of theory of mind that kicks it all off is the joint attention. And I think we didn't hear a lot about that particular 9-month revolution in this talk. And I was hoping that you could tell us about what we have evolved, so from an evolutionary perspective, relative to what non-human primates, haven't evolved, that will eventually combine to form this 9-month revolution.
My evolutionary story is that basically all the other primates forage. They may go around in groups, but every individual grabs what they can and goes off and eats it by themselves. Humans, at some point, were forced to collaborate in order to get food. If you were a bad collaborator, no one would partner with you, and you died and didn't leave any children. So there was social selection of the species, of the population, for being a good collaborator. This meant both cognitive skills of being able to form joint goals, understand the other's perspective, coordinating with communicating. They all come together. This coordination, mental coordination to support collaborative activity is what evolved to support this, and individuals who didn't have it. Also, by the way, on the sort of social moral side, if I tried to take all the food at the end, you wouldn't collaborate with me again either, and so there's selection for being more fair and things like that. So we were evolved to work, to collaborate together. Collaboration is co-labor, work together. So we evolved to collaborate together, to coordinate the collaboration through unique forms of communication. And that's the evolutionary background, that any evolutionary adaptation has to emerge at some point in ontogeny. It's surprising, and I've had some conflicts with some of the people and some discussions with some of the people in anthropology about why does it emerge so early? It doesn't seem if it's collaboration for gaining food, why wouldn't it be later? Sarah Hurdy talks about cooperative breeding. Yeah. I showed you that little arrow where some things that chimps do at older ages go down in ontogeny. So it is very possible that we evolve these joint attention and cooperative communication skills, and at least part of their function was in a cooperative breeding context where infants needed to solicit social relationships with many different caretakers and so forth. So that may be part of the story as well. But basically, we need to collaborate in ways that they don't, and individuals who weren't good at it were weeded out of the population by natural and social selection.
Hey, Mike. Great talk. While I was listening, I had a voice in the back of my mind, and the voice was Chomsky saying that the vast majority of use of natural language is for talking to ourselves in silence in our own heads, not for collaborating or interacting with an interlocutor. And I wanted to take that voice seriously, And so I tried to come up with a way of putting the two, your talk and this claim together. And if the social selection story you just said is something like what's correct, then the Chomsky suggestion is something like an exaptation, right? So we actually started off with this communication goal for this trait we have, but then we found it useful for multiple perspectives and inside our head. And then I was struck by the thought that interacting with another person, there's a bright line between me and you. And so it offers me the opportunity to really understand possibilities, because you really are a different possibility than me. And then I thought, okay, yeah, that working that out in this clear space might empower a change inside. So what do you think about all that?
Well, okay. I would say that, Chomsky doesn't believe that language evolved for communication, and I think almost everybody else does, including Pinker and Jackendorf and everybody else. And I believe it evolved for communication. And then your idea of the voice in the head type thing, I take an ontogenetic view of that. It's a Vygotskian view. That if you were on a desert island, you wouldn't get the inner conversation in your head. If you grew up on a desert island, it's not an acceptation in that sense of biological, but it's an internalization of the process during ontogeny of having a dialogue with someone else, and you internalize it and have it in your head. So, so that's what I would say about that part of it. And the second part was the last part? Right. So I briefly talked with Sue in the hallway, very briefly, that I can imagine that this idea of holding two possibilities in mind at the same time may have something to do with this idea of me encountering someone else who's, okay, so you think it's there, I think it's here, which is it? Okay, so I would, like many of these things, I would say the foundation is probably not going to be social. They're foundations about, but that it might be that this kind of social context where I have to hold in mind that I might be wrong and he might be wrong might somehow be related to that ability. And you could imagine a more nativist version of that, where our adaptation for interacting with others in this way automatically leads to considering these, or you could imagine a more developmental version of that, where our actual practice of interacting with others leads us to be able to do this. And I would be open to either one of those. But I think we know next to nothing about that process.
I'd like to take you a little bit beyond your data that you discussed. So you talked about children who were deaf, who were able to learn these skills much later on.
Yeah.
We're working to apply psychology in school contexts. We have children from lower socioeconomic status. Mom works 2 jobs, dad's in prison. No one interacts with these children the way that you interacted in the video. What can we help schools to do? We've tested these children. They lack inhibition skills. What can schools do to help to develop these skills? Realizing you probably don't have data in this environment.
Get some new political leaders who care about these things. Put some resources in that direction. I mean, I'm struck by the, oh God, I don't want to talk politics. Jesus, it's so depressing.
Do you think it can be done in a group context? Do you think it needs to be one-on-one?
Early on, I don't know if it needs to be, but I'm certainly not talking from research here. I'm just, I'm not talking from research. But in this theoretical kind of conception, you start with a kind of a joint intentionality because it's sort of straightforward. If I leave the collaboration, it's over. You're sunk. If we're in a group, I can leave and you've still got the other people in the group. So somehow there's this direct interdependence in doing it together that seems critical. We have some old studies, and other people have done similar things with twins, where parents are kind of overtaxed trying to take care of their twins, and that if they pair them off, I think there's data from, this is not our data, but if you pair them off and talk more to them one-on-one, more than if they're talking to both of them, I don't know, but we're beyond my area of competence here. But I would say that, you know, on the more direct level of yours, it would seem intuitive to me, but I don't have any data for that, that a lot of one-on-one would be a good thing.
Thank you.
That's enough. And then?
Well, this is an attractive scheme, but I'm just missing one element. What is the place of ostension in all this, if any?
Well, as you know, I am on the same page with all of you guys on ostension as being absolutely critical to the communicative capacities and for engaging with the other in this way. So I would say it is, I didn't mention it here, but when I said things like mental coordination and recursive mental coordination in communication, ostension is what sets the whole thing off. So humans are evolved both to present things to others ostensively and to react to ostension with this kind of mental coordination. So it's, if I were talking about, if I was focusing on communication, it would have been central to my account, and you and I agree on 90% and only disagree on about 10%, but it's absolutely central to the communicative part, which is an important part of this story that I'm telling here.
Hi, thank you.
I have to get his attention. He's got the microphone.
Thanks for the...
Yes. No. She was...
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's always a pleasure to hear your perspectives, and I was thinking, I'm sure a lot of people in this room may know a lot more about comparative cognition, but I've been looking at this book, Other Minds, Peter Godfrey Smith, and other descriptions of octopus behavior.
Very fun book, very good book, yes.
It's very interesting, and
I was wondering... He looked at octopuses.
And for they seem to show some signs of coordinating visual perspectives. And I was wondering whether it's possible for that to exist without the ability to read other minds in the way that humans have. So it seems like they have some components of it, but not the full mind reading capacity. So what do you think about the evolutionary relationship between these capacities?
Okay, so evolutionarily, what we have to understand, and this is the evolution people are really interested and focus on so-called parallel evolution. So the birds, those damn birds, where's Amanda? Those damn birds do a lot of incredible things of tool use and causal understanding and the mind reading where they only cache the food when somebody's looking. But if you look at the evolutionary tree, it almost certainly is not coming from a common source as what we do. They evolved it on their own. So there's certain social conditions and certain tool use conditions and whatever that lead to these things. I have no idea with octopuses, and I don't, my bookmarker is in the middle of that book. I'm not all the way through. Are there experimental studies or on visual coordination, or is this just his scuba diving impressions?
I can't recall a specific
Yeah. So I don't know the data especially well. The octopuses have basically, if you want to say it in a crazy way, they have like 8 brains, right? They have these little ganglia, each associated with each of their 8 things. They're absolutely foreign to, I have no idea. But the reason I brought up the parallel evolution is, given that we all come from these bilaterally symmetrical creatures from the Cambrian explosion 500,000 years ago, we all share these deep commonalities. One of the deepest findings and the most important and reliable findings in the Evo-Devo literature. So Evo-Devo, since we're developmentalists, I encourage everyone to tune into that literature. This is the evolution of development, that the way development happens evolves, okay, differently. Some creatures have almost no ontogeny. They're pop out, ready to go, and others have this long extended ontogeny like we do. And one of the findings when you look on the genetic level, which is what most of the Evo-Devo people look at, is the incredible amount of similarity, of conservation of basic genes for constructing the body, constructing the spinal and the neural and all that. They're the same genes, not they're parallel genes. They're the same genes that haven't changed. So there's a lot of stuff that's homologous, that's coming from a common ancestor, and there's a lot of stuff that develops in parallel, given that you have a somewhat similar starting point And then you end up in these evolutionary conditions which select for individuals who have causal understanding or whatever. So I don't know I can't speak to the specific issue of the octopuses, but we don't have a ladder leading from primitive guys to humans. It's not a ladder, it's a tree. It's not a ladder, it's a tree. Okay, the tree, we've got all these branches. So it's possible they're doing some things like that, but it would have been evolved separately from a separate starting point under similar evolutionary pressures.
Okay. Sue?
Yeah.
So I have a question.
Is that on?
Is that on?
Okay.
You claimed that the 2 to 3 year old shift across all those things was a maturation. What hangs on? First of all, how do you know? I mean, because of course you also argue that maturation won't happen in the absence of the social interactions. Why might it not be some kind of learning process?
It certainly could be. Okay, it certainly could be. But it's striking when, I guess I'm old enough to have Piagetian roots, and I know that maybe these are my Piagetian roots showing somehow, but when you see things that seem structurally similar, so it's a shift to an objective way of thinking or a normative way of thinking, when you see things that seem to you theoretically to have a similar structural design, as it were, and they're emerging at the same time, more or less, in ontogeny, that's the kind of conclusion you go to. But I absolutely agree that I don't really have any evidence. So I could imagine, for example, that there would be, let's say, a maturational expansion of executive function, and that would be responsible for all of them. Yeah. Okay, I could imagine that.
I could I can certainly imagine it.
Yeah.
But you asserted that it was right, and so I wonder whether you had any, whether there were.
If I can quote a great scholar that I've heard recently, I could argue the other side tomorrow.
Okay. So the last question.
I had a question, actually.
Let me say with regard to that as well, I was talking with Agnes yesterday as well. It is also possible, even though it's not my hypothesis, that the infants are really understanding false beliefs, and that this executive function and coordination stuff is all a separate thing that allows for the coordination, and the infant thing is the real thing. I don't believe that, because I don't think that if they aren't making the judgment that it's false, that they're really that it's really can be considered a belief. But that's also possible, that the coordination is really a function of developing executive function skills.
Okay, thank you, Mike.